rancher lived alone for years, until 10 Apaches appeared at his door. Wild West stories. John McAllister had lived on the open plains of Montana for nearly 10 years. His ranch sat alone in a wide valley, surrounded by rolling hills and endless stretches of grass. On most days, the wind seemed to be his only companion. He was a man used to silence, and over the years he had learned to find comfort in it. The only sounds he heard were the lowing of his cattle, the occasional caw of a crow, or the soft rustle of the prairie grass swaying in the breeze. Life here was simple, but it was not easy. Every day required hard work and careful attention, and John had grown strong and capable in ways that few people in town could imagine. He remembered when he first came to this land. Back then it had been even wilder. The grass grew high, and the trees along the river were thick and uncut. There were no neighbors for miles, and the nearest town was a half-day ride away. John had bought the ranch for very little money, mostly because no one else wanted it. It had been neglected and empty, but he saw potential. He had a vision of a life free from the crowded streets and noisy buildings of the town. He wanted to live honestly, with his hands in the soil and his eyes on the horizon. The first years were the hardest. He had to repair the old barn, mend fences, and dig wells. There were days when he thought about giving up, days when the cold winter winds whipped across the valley and left him shivering as he tried to patch a broken roof. There were nights when he lay awake, listening to the coyotes howl and the wind whistle through the trees, wondering if he had made a mistake coming here. But each morning he rose early, put on his boots, and faced the work again. Slowly, his hard work paid off. The land began to produce, the cattle thrived, and the ranch took on the quiet order that only someone who truly cared could create. John was a solitary man by nature. He didn't mind being alone. He had friends in town, people he had grown up with, but he rarely visited them. He preferred the company of his animals and the steady rhythm of ranch life. Some people called him gruff or unfriendly, but John didn't mind their opinions. He had learned long ago that life on the prairie demanded focus and independence. He liked to think that he was building something real, something lasting, and that the quiet hours he spent alone were not wasted, but valuable. Every day followed a routine, and John was a master of it. In the early morning he would feed the cattle and check the fences. He would ride his horse across the fields, inspecting the land and making sure everything was in order. He knew every corner of his ranch, the shallow creek where the cattle liked to drink, the old oak tree near the barn, the hill that offered a view of the valley. He knew which fences were weak, which gates needed oiling, and which cows were ready to give milk. Even though he was alone, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction in his work. The ranch was alive, and he was a part of it. Despite the hard work, John had his moments of enjoyment. He liked to sit outside at night when the stars filled the sky, the Milky Way stretching across the darkness. He often made himself a small fire, brewed a cup of coffee, and watched as the night creatures moved through the grass. Sometimes he would read a book or simply listen to the quiet, letting the peace of the land settle into his mind. He had learned to enjoy the little things, the taste of a fresh apple from his small orchard, the warmth of sunlight on his face, the smell of rain on the dry earth. These were simple pleasures, but they were enough for John. Even though he was content, the solitude sometimes weighed on him. On certain evenings when the wind howled and the sky was gray with clouds, he felt the pang of loneliness. There was no one to talk to, no friendly voice to break the silence. He missed the laughter of children, the chatter of neighbors, the warmth of a family. But he had chosen this life, and he reminded himself that it was a life of freedom. He had no one to answer to but himself, and the land belonged to him. That thought often carried him through the toughest moments. John's connection to the land went beyond work. He respected it deeply. He knew which areas needed rest, which fields could sustain more cattle, and which spots were best left untouched. He had learned to read the signs of the weather, predicting storms and sunny days with surprising accuracy. He understood the ways of the animals, noticing small changes in behavior that told him if a cow was sick or if a horse was restless. The land and the animals had become his companions, and in their presence he never felt truly alone. On one chilly autumn morning, John was riding along the northern fence line when he noticed a hawk circling high above. Its sharp eyes scanned the ground, and John watched with admiration as it swooped down to catch a small rabbit. He thought about how every creature on the prairie had its own way of surviving, just as he did. It reminded him that life was full of challenges, but also of small victories. He smiled at the thought and urged his horse forward, checking the fence posts and making sure the cattle were safe. Despite his contentment with solitude, John had a soft spot for visitors. Occasionally travelers would pass through, and he would offer them a meal or a place to rest for the night. These moments were brief, but they brought a spark of human connection that he secretly cherished. He never forced conversation or friendship, but he knew that a shared meal or a kind word could make a difference. It reminded him that, while he enjoyed being alone, he was still a part of the wider world. Years of living this way had shaped John into a man who could handle anything. He knew how to fix a broken wheel, mend a torn fence, tend to sick animals, and survive harsh winters. He'd faced storms that tore across the valley, fires that threatened his fields, and the occasional theft or stray predator. Each challenge made him stronger, more resourceful, and more confident in his abilities. He was proud of what he had built, and though few would understand, he felt a quiet satisfaction that ran deeper than words. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie, John often paused to take in the beauty of his land. The colors of the sky, the smell of the earth, and the distant calls of wildlife created a scene that was both peaceful and awe-inspiring. He felt a sense of belonging here, a connection to something larger than himself. The ranch was not just a place to live. It was a place where he had grown, learned, and found purpose. And so, John McAllister continued his life, day after day, year after year. He woke early, worked hard, and found contentment in the quiet routines of ranch life. Though he lived alone, he never felt weak or lost. He felt capable, resilient, and connected to the world around him. Little did he know that this life of solitude was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. One quiet afternoon, as the wind blew gently through the valley, a sound broke the usual rhythm of his life, a sound that would mark the beginning of a story unlike any he had ever known. John McAllister had just finished repairing a fence along the eastern pasture when he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was faint at first, almost like the rhythm of hooves far in the distance, but it grew louder with each passing second. John had grown used to the sounds of his land, the wind, the animals, the occasional call of a bird. But this was different. The pounding of hooves echoed across the valley, steady and deliberate. Something, or someone, was coming. Dank instinctively, John reached for his rifle, though he did not raise it. It had been years since he had seen a stranger on the property. Most people respected the distance, knowing the ranch was remote and the rancher wary of visitors. But now, as the noise grew louder, he could feel a mixture of curiosity and caution building in his chest. He shaded his eyes with his hand and scanned the horizon. Through the shimmering heat and dust of the late afternoon, he saw them. 10 men on horseback riding steadily toward him. They were not part of any group he recognized. Their clothing was different from the settlers in the nearby town, and their horses were swift, lean, and sure-footed. John studied them closely. Something about their movement, the way they rode, suggested skill and experience. They were careful, not reckless, and they rode with a sense of purpose. John's heart beat faster. He had been alone for so long that he had almost forgotten the feeling of meeting strangers. He considered turning back to the house to secure the doors and windows, but curiosity kept him rooted in place. The men were getting closer now. One of them raised a hand in a gesture that seemed cautious, almost polite. John lowered his rifle slightly but did not move forward. When they reached the edge of the yard, John could see more clearly who they were. They were Apaches, a small group, 10 in number, wearing traditional clothing mixed with the occasional piece of settler gear. They were not armed aggressively, but he could see that some carried small knives and one had a bow slung across his back. They did not seem hostile, but there was a quiet intensity in their eyes that made John keep his distance. The leader of the group, A man with a weathered face and calm eyes spoke a few words in English, broken but understandable. "We need water," he said slowly, pointing to the horses and then to himself. John was surprised. He had expected hostility, perhaps demands, but not this simple request. He nodded slowly, trying to show that he understood. John stepped forward cautiously. "You can have water," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous energy in his chest. "But you'll have to wait while I get it ready." He gestured toward the well near the barn. The leader of the Apaches nodded and motioned for the others to stay back. They dismounted carefully, their horses grazing lightly on the grass as John went to fill buckets with fresh water. As he carried the water back, John noticed the way the men observed everything. The land, the buildings, even the way the cattle moved. They were respectful, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. There was an unspoken understanding between them and the rancher. They were visitors, and he was offering hospitality, not weakness. This realization brought a strange sense of relief to John. Once the buckets were filled, John handed them to the leader, who drank deeply and then motioned for his companions to do the same. The horses were next. John guided them to the trough and watched as they drank, their heads dipping gracefully into the water. He could feel the tension in the air slowly fading. The men were not enemies. They were travelers, much like John had once been. After the water was done, John motioned for them to follow him to the house. He could see their hesitation, the way they glanced at the land, measuring distances, noting the fences and the position of the barn. But they complied, walking alongside him in silence. Inside the small cabin, John set out some bread and meat he had prepared earlier. The leader nodded in thanks, pointing at the food and then at his companions. They ate quietly but with visible relief, their expressions softening as hunger left them. Once the meal was done, John sat across from the leader. They could not speak much in the same language, but gestures and simple words allowed them to communicate the basics. The leader pointed to the hills in the distance, then shook his head slowly. John understood. They were traveling, moving through the land to avoid danger, perhaps other settlers or lawmen. They were seeking temporary refuge, a place to rest and regain strength. John felt a strange connection forming. He remembered his own travels before he had settled on this ranch, the times he had been weary and seeking a place to rest. He realized that, despite differences in culture, the desire for safety and comfort was universal. He offered a nod and a small smile, indicating that they were welcome to stay for the night. The leader smiled back, a quiet acknowledgement that trust had begun to form. Evening approached, and the valley began to cool. The men built a small fire outside, careful not to disturb the cattle. John stood at the doorway watching the smoke rise against the sunset. He noticed the way they worked together, sharing tasks without words, passing items with quiet efficiency. There was a rhythm to their actions, a discipline that reminded him of his own work on the ranch. It was clear they had survived difficult conditions together, relying on each other in ways John had only experienced alone. As the fire crackled, John brought out blankets and offered them to the visitors. The leader accepted, draping one over his shoulders, while the others wrapped themselves warmly. They gestured their thanks with nods and quiet words, creating a sense of mutual respect. John realized that this was more than just a visit. It was an exchange of understanding, a bridging of worlds that often stayed apart in the valleys and plains of Montana. Night fell, and the stars began to appear, scattered like diamonds across the sky. John and the leader sat near the fire, watching silently. The wind carried the distant sounds of the prairie, rustling grass, the low hum of insects, and the occasional call of a night bird. It was peaceful, almost surreal, to have strangers in his home without fear, without conflict. There was only presence, only acknowledgement of one another's humanity. Over the hours, John learned small things about the men. The leader gestured toward a small pouch he carried, pointing at the contents, and then at John. John understood. They had brought only what was necessary for survival. Moving, light, and fast, he saw the careful attention they paid to their surroundings, the way they scanned the horizon, always aware of potential dangers. They were travelers, but not reckless ones. They respected the land, much as John did, and that made him feel a quiet kinship. Before turning in for the night, John made a decision. He would allow them to stay a little longer, at least until they had regained their strength. He was curious to learn more about them, and perhaps, in some small way, they could help him with the work he could no longer manage alone. It was unusual for him to welcome visitors, but something about this group felt different. There was honesty in their eyes, trust in their gestures, and a shared understanding of the hardships of life on the land. As John lay in bed that night, listening to the soft breathing of the men outside and the occasional snort of the horses, he thought about how life could change in an instant. One moment, he had been alone for years, accustomed to silence and solitude. The next, a group of strangers appeared at his door, bringing with them stories, skills, and perhaps a new sense of connection. He realized that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could bring the greatest lessons. For John, the quiet ranch that had been his sanctuary for so long was now alive with presence. The shadows of the past were replaced by the warmth of companionship, however temporary it might be. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in many years he felt a spark of curiosity and hope. He had faced storms, isolation, and hard work before, but nothing had prepared him for this. The gentle intrusion of strangers into his world, not with violence or threat, but with simple, human need. And so, under the vast Montana sky, John McAllister drifted into sleep, knowing that the arrival of the 10 men had marked the beginning of a story he had never expected, a story that would test his heart, his patience, and his understanding of what it truly meant to share the land with others. The next morning, John awoke to the soft light of dawn spilling through the cabin window. The sounds of the prairie were familiar yet different today. There was the usual lowing of his cattle and the wind through the grass, but now there were also murmurs, soft words spoken in a language he did not understand, and the occasional clatter of hooves as the Apaches moved around the barn. He stretched, rubbed his eyes, and quietly got out of bed. Something about this morning felt different. The presence of the visitors had already changed the rhythm of his life, even in just a single night. He stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against his face. The men were already up, working with a quiet efficiency he had come to admire. Some were tending to the horses, brushing their coats and checking their hooves. Others were gathering wood for the fire that still smoldered from the night before. John watched them for a moment, noticing how carefully they moved, how they respected the land and the animals. It reminded him of his own early years on the ranch, when every task had to be done with attention and care. "Morning," John called out, his voice carrying over the open fields. The leader of the group looked up and returned the greeting with a nod. Though they did not share the same language, there was a sense of understanding between them. John felt a strange comfort in this. It was rare to communicate without words, but still feel completely understood. Breakfast was a quiet affair. John prepared eggs and bread over the small stove while the visitors helped themselves to coffee he had brewed. They ate with their hands, politely and efficiently, occasionally offering small gestures of thanks. John watched them closely. Even in these simple acts, there was a rhythm, a grace, and a respect for what they had been given. It struck him how different their lives must have been, yet how similar in some ways. Survival, food, and the care of animals were universal needs. After breakfast, John decided it was time to try to learn more about why they had come and who they were. The leader, whose calm eyes seemed to hold a quiet wisdom, was the only one who spoke a little English, but even that was limited. John gestured for him to sit and pointed toward the chairs. The man understood and motioned for the others to do the same, though some remained standing, still tending to the horses outside. John picked up a pencil and a piece of paper. He drew simple maps and shapes, trying to communicate. The leader watched carefully and nodded at the drawings. He then took a small stick and traced lines in the dirt outside, indicating mountains, rivers, and paths. John could see that they were traveling, moving through the land carefully, avoiding places that might be dangerous. It became clear to him that they were not here by accident. This was deliberate. They had chosen his ranch as a stopover, a place to rest and gather strength before continuing their journey. Over the next few hours, John began to piece together bits of their story. They were a small band of Apache men traveling across Montana and nearby territories. Their movement was cautious, designed to avoid conflicts with settlers and other travelers who might see them as a threat. They carried only what was necessary, traveling light and fast, relying on each other's skills to survive. John noticed the way they worked together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs without words, a practice born of years of shared experience in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. As he listened, John realized how difficult their journey must have been. They had faced hunger, cold nights, and dangerous terrain. Their clothing, while practical, showed signs of wear, and the way they handled the horses demonstrated experience and endurance. It was clear that every member of the group contributed to their survival. John found himself respecting their determination, courage, and resourcefulness. Despite their differences, they shared a bond with him, an understanding of life that was shaped by the land and the demands of living closely with nature. By mid-morning, the leader began to use gestures to explain more personal details. He pointed to his heart, then to John, suggesting trust and mutual respect. He drew symbols in the dirt to indicate family, home, and movement across the land. John saw the longing in his eyes, the subtle sadness of being far from home, yet the resilience that kept him moving forward. It was a reminder that survival was never just about food and shelter. It was also about hope, connection, and perseverance. John asked questions through gestures and simple words, wanting to know more about their lives. The leader showed him a small pouch containing beads and feathers, pointing to each and explaining in gestures their importance. Some were gifts, some were tokens of memory from their families, and others represented experiences from their travels. John realized that these men carried not only physical necessities, but also pieces of their history, culture, and identity with them. He felt honored that they were willing to share even these small glimpses of their lives. The day passed with a rhythm of shared tasks and silent observation. John showed them how he managed the cattle, how he mended fences, and how he cared for the land. In return, they demonstrated techniques for tracking, finding water, and maintaining horses in rugged conditions. John marveled at their skills. He had thought he was capable in all things related to ranch life, but these men had knowledge and experience that complemented his own. Together, they made a small but efficient team, working with a harmony that was rare and beautiful. Around midday, John walked with the leader to the edge of the property. The man pointed to the hills and mountains in the distance, then back to his band, as if explaining their route. John understood that their journey would be long and challenging, but it would be safer if they rested here and gathered strength. He nodded, feeling a sense of responsibility. Though he had lived alone for years, the presence of these men now made him aware that he could offer something beyond food and water. He could offer trust, shelter, and a measure of safety. As the sun climbed higher, John noticed the way the men interacted with each other. There was laughter in small, quiet moments, gestures of kindness, and shared concern for their horses and each other. It was clear that they were a tight-knit group, relying on one another for survival and support. John reflected on his own solitary life and realized that, though he had been self-sufficient, he had also missed the companionship and teamwork that these men demonstrated naturally. By afternoon, the leader began to show John more practical aspects of their culture. He demonstrated how to tie knots efficiently, how to start a fire using natural materials, and how to make simple repairs to equipment without modern tools. John was impressed by the ingenuity and practicality of these methods. It reminded him that life on the prairie demanded adaptability, creativity, and knowledge passed down through generations. He felt a growing respect for the men and a desire to learn more from them. As evening approached, John and the leader sat near the fire once again. This time, there was less need for gestures and more for simply sharing presence. The other men moved quietly around the property, finishing their chores and tending to the animals. John felt a sense of peace he had not experienced in years. He had expected fear or conflict when strangers arrived at his door, but instead, he found understanding, respect, and a chance to see life from a different perspective. The leader pointed to the stars, then to John, and finally to the land. John understood this as a gesture of gratitude and acknowledgement. They had traveled far, faced many challenges, and yet here, on his ranch, they felt a moment of safety and respite. John realized that this experience was not just about survival. It was about connection. It was about recognizing shared humanity, even when language, culture, and history were different. That night, John lay in bed reflecting on the day. He had learned more than he could have imagined about these men and their lives. They were not just travelers passing through. They were people with hopes, fears, and dreams, just like him. He understood that the land had brought them together, creating an unexpected friendship based on mutual respect and shared challenges. For the first time in many years, John felt that his life of solitude had been interrupted not by danger but by opportunity, a chance to broaden his understanding and form a connection that would last far beyond a single visit.
As he drifted to sleep, John thought about the days ahead.
The Apaches would need time to rest, to regain strength, and perhaps to teach him even more about surviving on this rugged land. He felt a quiet anticipation, a sense that life was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. The land had always been a teacher, and now it was teaching him a new lesson, that sometimes trust and friendship could arrive unexpectedly, even at the door of a man who had lived alone for so long. The next morning, the ranch felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. John McAllister woke to the sounds of quiet movement, horses pawing at the ground, soft laughter from the Apaches, and the gentle rustling of the grass in the morning breeze. It was different from his usual solitude. Instead of the lonely calls of birds or the wind, there was now a rhythm of life shared with others, a sense of energy that had been missing for so long. After a quick breakfast of eggs and bread, John stepped outside to see the Apaches already at work. Some were leading the horses to pasture, others were carrying wood and checking the fences. They moved together with a practiced rhythm, communicating without words, their gestures precise and deliberate. John watched for a moment, impressed by how smoothly they coordinated, each action complementing the other. He realized that even in a small group, cooperation and trust could create efficiency far beyond what he had ever achieved alone. "Need help?" John asked, stepping forward. The leader smiled slightly and nodded. He handed John a rope and gestured toward a gate that needed fixing. Together they worked quietly, passing the tools back and forth, repairing the fence with steady hands. John noticed the patience in their movements, the way they observed every detail, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. It was different from his usual solo work, where speed sometimes mattered more than precision. With the Apaches, it felt like each action had intention, a respect for the land and for one another. As the morning passed, John introduced the men to his routine. He showed them how he checked the cattle for signs of illness and how he maintained the water troughs. In return, they taught him techniques for managing horses that he had never considered. One of the younger men demonstrated a way to calm a nervous horse using only subtle gestures and tone of voice. John was amazed at how effective it was. He had thought he knew everything about horses, but here was a skill that complemented his own experience. By midday, the sun was high, and the men had helped repair several sections of fence that John had been meaning to fix for months. They also had gathered extra firewood and cleared the area around the barn, making it more organized and safe. John felt a growing admiration for their skill, patience, and attention to detail. These were people who had lived close to the land all their lives, learning to survive through observation, experience, and mutual support. He felt a sense of humility, realizing that he still had much to learn from them. During a brief break, John walked with the leader to the small orchard behind the cabin. The man gestured toward the trees, pointing to the fruit and nodding in appreciation. John smiled, understanding that they recognized the value of cultivation, of patience and care. He explained, using simple words and gestures, how the orchard had grown over the years and the effort it took to protect the young trees from frost and pests. The leader listened attentively, nodding occasionally and pointing at a few of the trees as if to remember the lessons. Later in the afternoon, a small challenge arose. One of the younger horses had become tangled in a broken fence. It panicked, kicking and pulling at the wood, risking injury to itself. John immediately sprang into action, but before he could reach it, one of the Apaches stepped forward. With calm movements, he approached the horse, speaking softly in his language, using gentle touches to calm it. Within moments, the horse was still, allowing John and the young man to safely untangle it. John felt a surge of respect and gratitude. He had handled many difficult situations alone, but here was a demonstration of teamwork. and patience that he had never experienced. By the end of the afternoon, the ranch was transformed. Fences were stronger, the barn area cleaner, and the animals calmer and well-fed. The work had been long and tiring, but there was a sense of satisfaction in the air. John noticed that the Apaches moved as a single unit, each action deliberate, each task completed with care. He realized that trust had been established not through words, but through shared effort. They had proven themselves reliable, respectful, and capable. In return, John felt himself opening to the idea of friendship and partnership, something he had rarely allowed in his life of solitude. As the sun began to set, John invited the men to sit around the fire he had built. They shared food and water, and though the conversation was limited, the silence was comfortable. There was a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the day's work and the growing bond between them. John reflected on how strange and unexpected this connection was. He had lived alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to rely on others, to share responsibilities, and to experience camaraderie. The leader, sensing John's thoughts, gestured toward the land and then back to him. It was a simple message. Respect for the land brings understanding between people. John nodded, appreciating the wisdom in the gesture. He realized that these men were not just guests, they were teachers, offering lessons in patience, observation, and cooperation that went far beyond practical skills. They showed him how to work with others, how to trust, and how to value human connection alongside self-reliance. As night fell, the men helped prepare a small meal using some of the supplies John had provided and a few items they had carried. They shared it together, the firelight dancing on their faces. John noticed the way they laughed quietly at small jokes, the care they showed in dividing the food fairly, and the respect they maintained for one another.
It was a simple, ordinary scene, but for John it was extraordinary.
He had never witnessed such harmony, such mutual respect, and it left a lasting impression on him. After the meal, John and the leader sat outside, watching the stars appear one by one. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, and the fire's warmth offered comfort against the cool night air. John felt a sense of connection not only to the land, but also to the people who now shared it with him. He realized that life was not meant to be endured alone. It was meant to be shared, even in small ways. Trust, cooperation, and mutual respect could turn strangers into companions, and hardship into opportunity. The Apaches stayed near the cabin that night, each man resting with the calm knowledge that they were safe and respected. John lay in bed, thinking about the day. He had learned more about work, patience, and human connection than he could have imagined. The ranch, which had been a sanctuary for years, now felt different. It felt alive, filled with possibility. The presence of these men had transformed it from a place of solitude into a place of learning, growth, and friendship. The next morning, the pattern continued. John and the Apaches worked side by side, tending to the land, caring for the animals, and repairing what needed fixing. With each passing day, the trust between them deepened. The men shared more of their knowledge: how to track animals over long distances, how to read subtle signs in the landscape, how to find water in hidden places. John absorbed it all, amazed at the depth of understanding they had developed through years of living in harmony with nature. Through shared labor and quiet observation, John began to see a larger truth. Solitude had taught him self-reliance, but connection had taught him strength. Working with others, sharing skills and knowledge, and trusting each other created something far greater than he had ever imagined. By the end of the week, he no longer saw them as strangers. They were companions, friends in the truest sense of the word. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, John stood with the leader at the edge of the pasture. They watched the cattle grazing, the horses resting, and the land stretching endlessly before them. The leader nodded toward John, then pointed at the horizon, then back at the ranch. John understood. He had been tested in subtle ways, and he had proven himself trustworthy. In return, the men had shown him the value of patience, respect, and shared effort. It was a bond built on more than words, a bond built on action, trust, and mutual understanding. As night fell, John felt a deep sense of contentment. The ranch was no longer just his. It was shared, even if temporarily, with people who respected it and cared for it as he did. The work had been hard, the days long, but the reward was far greater than he had expected. He had gained more than assistance with chores. He had gained friendship, insight, and a renewed appreciation for the strength that comes from trusting others. And so, life on the ranch continued, now richer and fuller. John McAllister had discovered that even in a world of solitude, connection was possible. With patience, respect, and shared effort, strangers could become allies, and allies could become friends. The land remained challenging, but it was no longer lonely. The Apaches had shown him that partnership and trust could turn work into learning, effort into joy, and hardship into shared accomplishment. The morning sun rose over the valley, casting a warm, golden light across the prairie. John McAllister woke to a quiet, almost peaceful silence. The Apaches were up early, as always, preparing to continue their journey. Today would be different. John knew this was the day they would leave. Though he had grown used to their presence over the past week, he understood that their journey could not pause forever. They had responsibilities, places to reach, and people to care for, just as he had his ranch and animals to tend. John stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The men were already busy packing their few belongings, securing the horses, and checking the trails they would take. The leader approached him, eyes calm but serious, and gestured with a series of simple movements. Gratitude, respect, and farewell. John nodded, understanding that this was not a simple goodbye, but a recognition of the connection they had shared. In silence, they began the final preparations for departure. The Apaches worked efficiently, gathering their small supplies and checking the horses for any signs of fatigue or injury. John watched, admiring their careful attention to detail. Every action was purposeful, every movement deliberate. He realized that this efficiency, born of years of living close to the land and relying on one another, was something he had learned to appreciate deeply over the past days. The quiet teamwork had become a part of the rhythm of the ranch, and its absence would soon leave a noticeable void. John led them to the edge of the pasture, where the horses waited. One by one they mounted, the leather of saddles creaking softly in the early morning air. John had offered to ride with them part of the way, but they shook their heads, indicating that this was their journey alone. He understood. It was important that they continue their path unencumbered, just as he had learned to live independently on his land. Before leaving, the leader dismounted and approached John. He handed him a small bundle, wrapped carefully in cloth. Inside were a few tokens, a carved piece of wood, a small feather, and some beads. John understood the gesture immediately. These were symbols of respect, friendship, and gratitude. He accepted them with both hands, feeling the weight not just of the objects, but of the meaning behind them. The leader then pointed to the horizon, then to John, and finally placed his hand over his heart. It was a simple, silent message. We will remember this place. We will remember you. As the group mounted their horses and began riding toward the distant hills, John felt a mix of emotions. There was sadness at their departure, a sense of emptiness at the thought of returning to his solitary life, and yet also a deep gratitude for the time they had spent together. In just a week, his perspective had changed. He had come to understand that connection, trust, and shared effort could enrich life in ways solitude alone never could. John watched them disappear into the rolling hills, the dust of their passage settling slowly over the land. For a long moment he stood still, absorbing the quiet and reflecting on everything he had learned. The land itself seemed to hold a new meaning. The fences he had repaired, the cattle he had tended, and even the small orchard he had nurtured. All of it had felt different with the Apaches by his side. Their presence had transformed ordinary tasks into shared accomplishments, making him realize that work and life are always richer when others are involved. After the dust cleared and the silence returned, John walked back to the cabin. The emptiness was familiar, yet it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt like a space that had been temporarily shared, a place that had hosted friendship, trust, and learning. He looked around the small home he had built and maintained for years. Each object, each corner, seemed to carry a memory of the past week. The laughter around the fire, the careful tending of the animals, the quiet lessons in patience and observation. Throughout the day, John continued his work on the ranch, but everything felt different. Feeding the cattle, repairing fences, and checking the water troughs were no longer solitary chores. He thought about the Apaches and the ways they had approached each task with mindfulness and skill. He tried to incorporate some of their techniques, adjusting his methods slightly and noticing improvements in efficiency and care. The land itself seemed to respond, as if recognizing the shared effort and respect that had been cultivated over the past week. As evening approached, John sat outside, staring at the horizon where the men had disappeared. The sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the valley was quiet except for the gentle rustling of grass and the distant calls of wildlife. John felt a profound sense of connection, not only to the land but to the memory of the visitors who had left such a strong impression on him. He realized that life is not just about survival or self-sufficiency. It is also about the bonds formed through shared experience, mutual respect, and kindness. John began to reflect on the lessons the Apaches had taught him. He remembered the way they had worked together, each action purposeful, each task completed with care. He thought about their knowledge of the land, their patience, and their ability to read signs in nature that he had never noticed before. But most importantly, he remembered the quiet trust that had developed between them, a trust that had been earned through action, respect, and shared effort rather than words alone. The following days passed in a rhythm that felt both familiar and different. John returned to his routine, feeding cattle, repairing fences, and maintaining the ranch. But now he did so with a new perspective. He paid more attention to small details, observed the land with greater care, and worked with a sense of mindfulness he had not possessed before. Every task reminded him of the lessons learned from his visitors, the value of patience, the importance of teamwork, and the strength found in mutual respect. John also began to think about the importance of openness. For years he had chosen isolation, believing that self-reliance was the only way to live successfully on the ranch. But the past week had shown him that connection could coexist with independence. It was possible to remain self-sufficient while still welcoming others into your life, even temporarily, and to learn from their skills and experience. This realization gave him a renewed sense of hope and purpose. One evening, as John prepared a small fire and watched the stars appear, he realized that the Apache's visit had left a permanent mark on his life. It was not just the lessons about work or survival that mattered. It was the understanding of human connection and shared responsibility. He understood that life, like the land, is richer when cultivated with care, patience, and respect for others. Even temporary companionship could create lasting change in perspective, making solitude not a burden, but a choice complemented by experience and memory. Over time, John shared small pieces of this story with the few neighbors he occasionally visited in town. He did not speak much about the specifics, respecting the privacy and dignity of his guests, but he conveyed the lessons learned, the importance of trust, cooperation, and kindness. People listened with interest, and some remarked on how his perspective seemed fuller, more thoughtful, and less guarded than before. John simply nodded, understanding that true learning often happens quietly, without needing recognition or applause. As the seasons passed, John continued his life on the ranch, now with a heart and mind changed by the experience. He worked with renewed energy, cared for the land with greater attentiveness, and remembered the quiet moments around the fire, the laughter and the shared work with the Apaches. He occasionally looked toward the distant hills, wondering where his visitors might be, hoping that they too carried memories of the time spent together. Years later, John would reflect on that week with a sense of gratitude. It had been brief, but it had left an indelible mark on his life. The Apaches had arrived unexpectedly, bringing not only their presence but lessons in patience, teamwork, respect, and trust. They had reminded him that even in a life built on solitude, human connection has value, and that sometimes the most meaningful encounters come from the most unexpected places. In the end, the ranch remained his sanctuary, but it was no longer defined solely by isolation. It was a place where life, work, and human connection intertwined. The land, the animals, and the memories of the Apache's visit created a tapestry of experience that John carried with him for the rest of his days. It was a story of friendship, trust, and the quiet power of shared understanding, A story that proved that even in the wide open plains of Montana, hearts can meet and lives can be forever changed. And as the sun set over the valley, casting long shadows across the fields and hills, John McAllister felt a sense of peace. He had learned that life is richest when it is shared, even if only for a short time. He had learned that trust and respect could bridge worlds, that work and effort could create bonds, and that the simplest acts of kindness could leave lasting impressions. For the rest of his life, the memory of that week would remain with him, a reminder that even the quietest lives can be transformed by the unexpected presence of others, and that connection, once made, is never truly forgotten.